Jerusalem's sun hides a terrifying secret. The deepest blindness is born where the light is strongest. You will see how the guardians of truth transformed faith into a theater of shadows, and why your biblical knowledge might actually be pushing you away from God. Do not miss the revelation of the silent collapse we are repeating today. Stay tuned to understand the visceral fear of healing that lives within pride. What I am about to show you will change your vision forever. You wait until you see it. The Jerusalem sun does not forgive those who try to look at it head on. And on the white stone stairways leading to the holiest place on earth, the reflection of the marble hits your eyes like a sharp blade, cutting your vision before you can even understand what is before you. You walk among men who wear silence as armor and memorized prayers as a shield, feeling the weight of centuries of tradition that, instead of liberating, seem to erect invisible walls around every heartbeat. The smell of dust mixed with the sweat of thousands of pilgrims creates a dense atmosphere, where the light is so abundant that the mind begins to play tricks, transforming shadows into certainties and the truth into a distant blur that no one seems truly interested in reaching. We were always told that danger lives in the darkness, but what no one had the courage to tell you is that the most dangerous blindness is born precisely where the light is strongest, or within the courtyards where religion becomes a flawless performance and pride disguises itself as holiness. Those men with long beards and clean hands, who knew every comma of the scriptures by name, were immersed in a paradox that your spirit might be facing right now. The conviction that we see everything is the first step toward total darkness. They looked to the sky for signs, but failed to realize that the ground beneath their feet was trembling with the arrival of something their rules could never contain or explain. There is a weariness that does not come from physical exertion, but from the exhaustive attempt to maintain a perfect vision of oneself before a mirror that religiosity itself has distorted over the years. While the Master of Galilee passed through those corridors with mud-stained feet and eyes heavy with a compassion that asked no permission, the guardians of the light closed the curtains of their souls, preferring the safety of their golden blindness to the risk of being healed. The mystery we are about to unveil is not about what they lost, but about how we, with our Bibles open and hearts locked, are repeating the exact same silent collapse. The wind blowing from the Judean hills brings with it the scent of dry earth and the distant sound of hammers striking chisels, a constant reminder that in Jerusalem everything is built to last an eternity, including the convictions that imprison the spirit. You observe the rhythmic movement of the teachers of the law, the men whose hands carry the calluses of decades handling heavy scrolls and whose eyes are reddened from the effort of reading under the flickering light of clay lamps. There is an almost suffocating dignity in the way they adjust their linen tunics, a choreography of perfection that hides the trembling of hands that, deep down, no longer feel the warmth of the divine presence they claim to protect. And the psychology of these men was a labyrinth of defenses built to avoid contact with their own vulnerability. For in their world, admitting a doubt was like leaving an exposed crack in the city wall. They firmly believed that accumulating data about God was the same as knowing God, transforming faith into a cold science where the heart was sacrificed on the altar of theological accuracy. The paradox begins to close here. The more they defined the margins of the light, the more they expelled from it anything that smelled of humanity, weakness, or a real need for redemption. What you and I often ignore is that this same armor of knowledge can become our own spiritual casket, where we feel safe because we know the answers, but we are freezing to death inside. Imagine the weight of sustaining a mask of absolute clarity while your inner world is in shambles. An invisible tension that makes sweat bead on your forehead, even under the shadow of marble columns. Jesus walked through there and saw not just masters, but men exhausted by the weight of their own certainties, blind to the fact that the light they so fiercely defended no longer illuminated the way out of their own pride. Twilight begins to paint the walls of Jerusalem in shades of purple and blood, while torches are lit in the great lampstands, casting dancing shadows that distort the figures of those still moving through the temple. You feel the air suddenly grow cold. It is the kind of cold that seems born from the inside out. A shiver that runs down your spine as you realize that in that place of worship, the real object of cult, had changed faces. Amid the whispers of evening prayers, what is heard is not the cry of souls hungry for God, but the dry noise of those checking if their own image is properly aligned with the expectations of others. Spiritual blindness here gains a new layer of complexity, for it feeds on the mutual approval of those who decided that the appearance of piety was a lucrative substitute for the sincerity of the spirit. It is a psychology of mirrors, where each Pharisee looks to his peer to confirm his own righteousness, creating a closed circuit of validation that prevents any ray of external light from penetrating the armor. They could not see the Christ because they were too busy seeing themselves reflected in the glow of their own virtues accumulated over a lifetime of fasts and meticulous tithing. There is a dull ache in this existence, a profound loneliness of one who knows that if the mask falls, nothing will remain but a desert of dry bones and accumulated dust. The light they believed they possessed was, in truth, a spotlight they pointed at themselves, blinding them to the presence of the one who came to break all mirrors and reveal what truly dwells in the dark of the human chest. While Jesus watched the widow cast her 2 small coins into the offering box, he was looking through all the visual and technical opulence of the teachers of the law to focus on a single spark of truth. To the guardians of the temple, that woman was invisible, an insignificant detail in the grandeur of the religious system. But to the eyes of the one who sees the invisible, she was the only one who possessed real vision. The paradox becomes terrifying when we realize that we can be surrounded by sacred symbols, songs, and flawless rituals, and still be the only ones who don't notice that God left the building long ago, leaving us alone with our lamps lit and our hearts extinguished. Night has fallen over Jerusalem, but the temple still pulses with residual energy, the heat of the stones returning to the air, what it absorbed during the day. And while guards raise their torches and the crackling of the fire is the only sound breaking the stillness of the inner courtyards, you now find yourself in a narrow corridor where the smell of burning oil is so strong it seems to permeate the skin, and the limestone walls seem to close in on you like the weight of a conscience that knows something is wrong but lacks the courage to name the discomfort. There is a type of silence that is not peace, but accumulated tension, on the silence of someone who heard a truth they cannot process and instead of surrendering, decides to suffocate it under layers of mental justifications and empty rituals. In this environment of elongated shadows, the psychology of Pharisaism reveals its darkest face. The visceral fear of the cure, because being cured means admitting one was sick. And for religious pride, the admission of weakness is a fate worse than death. They watched Jesus heal the man with the withered hand, not with joy, but with a cold and somber calculation, analyzing if that miracle violated the chronology of their rules, transforming the relief of human suffering into a technical piece of evidence for accusation. Blindness here is not organic. It is a political choice of the soul, a decision to keep the system intact even if people die of spiritual thirst within it, because the structure gives them power and the truth demands surrender. Imagine what happens inside a man who sees the hand of God acting before his eyes, but whose heart is so petrified that he prefers to squeeze his eyelids shut until blood vessels burst rather than change his mind about who he thinks he is. This internal conflict generates a cold sweat, a trembling in the hands they hid under the wide folds of their robes while they plotted in the dark how to silence the voice that was exposing the nakedness of their souls. And they did not hate Jesus for what he did, but for what his light revealed about what they had become. Guardians of a magnificent tomb decorated with gold and precious stones, but which inside contained nothing but ashes and the stench of a faith that rotted for lack of real use. You and I often act the same way when life places us before a mirror we don't want to look into, preferring the safety of our controlled blindness to the risk of being transformed by a truth we don't dominate. The paradox of the soul dying in the light is that we become experts at using the Bible itself to protect ourselves from God, creating a barrier of verses and interpretations that serve only to keep our lifestyle untouched and our ego on the throne. The pain of this moment is not about what others do to us, but about the silent sabotage we perform against our own redemption, choosing the artificial glow of our self-righteousness while eternity passes us by, and we don't even notice the touch of its garment. As Jesus took every step toward the cross, the blindness of the masters increased, as if the proximity of the final light forced them to dive into an even denser darkness so as not to be consumed by the glory they could not manipulate. They were losing the capacity to feel compassion, because compassion requires you to put yourself in another's place. And for those who feel at the top of the spiritual world, the other's place is just a step below. This is where the soul begins to die of thirst in the middle of the ocean, where knowledge overflows, but life slips through the fingers, leaving only the bitter taste of a desert we built ourselves with the marble of our certainties. The silence of the late hours in Jerusalem is interrupted only by the rhythmic sound of the temple guard's sandals against the cold pavement, a sound that echoes through the stone walls like a metallic and indifferent heartbeat. You find yourself in one of the side courtyards where moonlight can barely penetrate, but the glow of the oil torches creates a play of shadows that seems to give life to the marble columns. There is a heaviness in the air, a mixture of sacrifice smoke and the humidity of the night that clings to linen clothes, making every movement seem slower and laden with a funerary importance. Here, away from the eyes of the crowd, the psychology of image maintenance reveals its highest price. The nervous exhaustion of one who must ensure that no external light reveals the flaws in their own spiritual construction. Maintaining this blindness requires a monumental effort, a constant vigilance over words, gestures, and even glances, so that nothing escapes the rigorous control of tradition. The Pharisees were not just blind men. They were architects of a damage control system where any sign of life or divine spontaneity was seen as a threat to the established order. If you have ever felt the exhaustion of trying to look perfect in a religious environment, you know the cold sweat that broke on the foreheads of these men when Jesus spoke of a God who looks at the heart and not at the exterior. The pain of living in a labyrinth of mirrors is that you end up becoming your own jailer. He's locked in a cell made of theological certainties that no longer produce comfort, only isolation. While the councils gathered in haste, conspiring under the flickering light of the lamps, the atmosphere was one of controlled desperation. The fear that the light Jesus brought might set fire to the structure they took centuries to build. They were not protecting God. They were protecting the relevance of their own positions and the security of their identities based on performance. Spiritual blindness manifests as an allergy to the raw truth, an obsessive need to filter reality through dogmas so that the impact of God's presence is neutralized before it touches the soul. It is the final paradox. Being at the center of divine revelation and using that very revelation as an umbrella to keep from getting wet in the rain of grace falling on the sinners next to you. What these men ignored, and what we often forget, is that the soul dies when it stops being honest, when the fear of being discovered outweighs the desire to be transformed. The skin of these leaders, though ritually washed, hid a dryness that no temple water could quench, a thirst of the soul they tried to fill with the noise of their own voices in the synagogues. The cost of keeping the shadows in a world where the light of the world is walking is the loss of one's own humanity, turning men who should have been shepherds into pillars of salt, they static in their self-righteousness, while life passes and leaves them behind, petrified in their own pride. If this silence about our own blindness is finding a place in you, and if you feel that the weight of keeping up appearances has stolen the real glow from your walk with God, I invite you to take a deep breath now. This is not a moment of condemnation, but an invitation to the rest that only the naked truth can offer. If you feel it is time to lower your guard and allow God to heal what you have been trying to hide, leave your sign of support and join us on this journey back to simple, pure vision. Comment below the phrase, "I accept the rest." By doing so, you signal to your own soul that the time of pretending is over and that the healing has finally begun. The early morning in Jerusalem brings a silence that seems to weigh tons on the shoulders of those still watching, while the torches in the temple courtyards begin to struggle against the depleting oil, casting erratic flashes over the stones polished by time. You walk through solitary arcades, where the only movement is that of suspended dust shining like particles of gold under the dying light, creating an atmosphere of a glory that refuses to depart, but no longer warms anyone. The smell of burnt meat from the previous day's sacrifices still hangs in the air, mixed with the aroma of damp cedar, evoking a sense of a holiness that has become mechanical, a state protocol that demands all your energy, but offers nothing in return for your hungry spirit. In this landscape of architectural solitude, the psychology of religious control reveals its cruelest facet: the isolation of one who has become a slave to their own authority. Those who sat in the seats of Moses lived in permanent emotional exile, forbidden from showing any uncertainty or need, for their position depended on maintaining a facade of spiritual omniscience. They couldn't simply lower their guard and admit that Jesus' words made their blood run cold and their hearts beat with a hope they had buried decades ago under the weight of rabbinic commentaries and sterile debates. Blindness, at this stage, becomes a form of social survival. In seeing the truth would mean losing one's place at the table, respect in the squares, and the security of a predictable life. The paradox of the soul that dies in the light is that it becomes addicted to the glow emanating from itself, losing the ability to be illuminated by something greater. It is the syndrome of the prisoner who, after years in the darkness of a decorated cell, comes to hate the sun because it exposes the dirt on their walls and the poverty of their furniture. When Jesus entered these spaces, he didn't just bring a new doctrine. He brought a light that could not be tamed. And it was this refusal to be controlled that awakened the deepest hatred in those who had transformed faith into a shadow management business. If you feel that your spiritual life has become a performance to maintain your status or to avoid disappointing others' expectations, you are breathing the same stale air that suffocated the masters of Jerusalem. The ultimate tragedy is not that they didn't know who Jesus was, but that they knew enough to understand that if they followed him, their world would have to end. They chose blindness as a shield against the chaos of transformation, preferring slow death within a known system to the explosive and unpredictable life that grace offers. Their skin, dry from the sun and marked by years of rigor, was the map of an internal resistance that refused to bow the knee to the obvious, a thankless struggle to keep a lamp lit while the midday sun was already in the sky. In the end, The soul that chooses its own light ends up becoming a black hole, consuming everything sacred to feed its own ego, until nothing remains but a cold silence and the eternal darkness of one who had God before them and preferred to look at their own reflection in the marble. The sun begins to tear the eastern horizon, but the light it brings does not seem welcome through the cracks of the heavy windows of the Sanhedrin, where the air is saturated with the smell of ancient parchment and the trail of sesame oil from the lamps that burned all night. You observe the faces of these men under the pitiless clarity of the morning, noting how the light highlights every furrow of worry on their foreheads, and how their hands, though clean of any manual labor, tremble slightly as they handle the scrolls of the law. There is a metaphysical exhaustion in the environment. The weight of those who spent hours on end trying to frame the infinite within frames of human interpretation, only to discover that the mystery of God is like desert sand that escapes through the fingers the more we try to squeeze it. They speak of God with a technical authority that chills the blood, but there is no glow in their eyes of those who were burned by the burning bush. There is only the dull reflection of a light that has been filtered so many times it has lost its heat and the ability to give life. This stage of spiritual blindness is marked by a psychology of substitution, where the living experience of the sacred is exchanged for the accumulation of definitions about the sacred, creating an internal desert where nothing grows but the dry weeds of resentment against those who can still feel. When they heard the parables of Jesus, and their minds worked like dissecting machines, searching for logical errors or disciplinary infractions, while their hearts were unable to be moved by the beauty of the message or the relief it brought to the oppressed. If you have ever felt trapped in a Christianity that feels like a courtroom, where every thought of yours is weighed and judged even before it is felt, you understand the exile of those who live at the center of the light, but inhabit a soul that has become a tomb of ice. The pain here is not born of ignorance, but of the loss of the capacity to wonder. For to the spiritual blind man, who knows everything, God has ceased to be a presence and has become a concept that can be archived and controlled. As the city wakes up to the noise of vendors and the bleating of sheep destined for sacrifice, the masters of religiosity feel the ground shake under the impact of a simplicity they can no longer understand. Their blindness manifests in contempt for what is small, what is humble, and what does not come sealed by their own official approval. And they cannot see that the glory of God manifests more intensely in the tears of a repentant sinner than in the glitter of the gold that coats the walls of the Holy of Holies. It is the paradox of excess baggage. They carry so much information about the Messiah that their hands are too busy to embrace him when he finally appears before them. The soul dies in the light, when light ceases to be a guide and becomes a property, a trophy of superiority that we use to separate ourselves from those we judge to be in darkness, without realizing that the isolation we create is our own condemnation to eternal cold. The skin of these men, though protected by rich robes, seems increasingly pale and lifeless, a map of a spiritual malnutrition that occurs even while they feast on the knowledge of the scriptures, where they are like navigators who have memorized all the star maps but are terrified of getting into a boat and feeling the sway of the real sea beneath their feet. Spiritual blindness is, ultimately, a refusal to sail, a decision to stay in the safe harbor of dead certainties while the wind of the Spirit blows in directions we cannot predict. The cost of this choice is a life of echo, where we repeat the words of the ancients without ever having heard the voice of the living God who inspired them, and transforming our religion into a museum of memories where we are the main exhibits, static and breathless, while the true light continues to advance, leaving us behind in our own bright darkness. The morning sun is already high, casting a white and pitiless light over the marble of the temple, turning the central courtyard into a stage where every move is calculated to convey an image of unreachable purity. You walk among the columns and realize that the air, once fresh, now carries the sweet and heavy smell of crushed flowers mixed with the metallic odor of fresh animal blood flowing through the drainage channels. It is an environment where visual luxury attempts to cover the fragility of life, where the glint of gold serves to distract the eyes from the dust accumulating in the dark corners. Observing the Pharisees walking with their wide phylacteries and their impeccable tassels, you notice a rigidity in their necks, a tension of those who know they are being watched, and that any slip in posture could ruin the illusion of holiness they built with such effort. The psychology of the whitewash, the layer of white paint Jesus used to describe the tombs, is the most tragic face of spiritual blindness, for it focuses all human energy on the aesthetics of the surface while ignoring internal decay. These men spent hours washing their hands and cups, but their thoughts were a tangle of envy, fear, and a thirst for control, feelings they suffocated under a thick layer of public rituals. If you have ever felt the need to smile and say, "Everything is fine," in a church hallway, while your heart screamed in agony or doubt, you know exactly what it's like to live inside a whitewashed tomb. The pain of being blind to one's own condition is that you end up believing your own lie, confusing the applause of men with the favor of God, without realizing that your spirit is running out of oxygen under the weight of so many overlapping masks. God's light, for these men, had ceased to be a scalpel that heals and had become a spotlight of vanity, where they paraded their virtues to be seen by others, transforming spirituality into a theater of shadows. They could not see in Jesus the solution to their problems because for them, there were no problems to be solved, only reputations to be maintained. Our spiritual blindness reaches its peak when we lose the ability to feel disgust at our own hypocrisy, when we get used to the smell of internal death because it is well kept behind a wall of good works and theological knowledge. It is a voluntary exile from reality, where we prefer to inhabit a fiction of purity rather than face the naked truth that we are just desperate sinners in need of a touch of mercy that we cannot buy or manufacture. The skin of these leaders, though protected from heavy labor, seems to have the texture of dry parchment without the vigor of one who is fed by the water of life, reflecting a life of restraint and repression rather than freedom and flow. They are the guardians of a system that rewards appearance and punishes vulnerability, creating a culture where truth is seen as a threat and transparency as a capital sin. The soul dies in the light when light is used to hide instead of reveal. Mastir, when we use our religiosity as a smokescreen to avoid a real encounter with the God who is not impressed by our titles, but who weeps before our open wounds. The cost of being a whitewashed tomb is absolute loneliness. For no one can truly love who never allows themselves to be known, and nothing can heal who insists on saying they were never hurt. Midday in Jerusalem is not just an hour. It is a confrontation, a moment when the sun reaches its zenith and shadows disappear, leaving every imperfection of the stones and every stain on the robes exposed to the judgment of absolute clarity. You feel the heat vibrate over the pavement, creating a mirage that makes the solid structures of the temple seem to oscillate, as if reality itself were struggling to stay cohesive before a truth that transcends it. The air is heavy with the smell of human sweat and the dust that rises with the incessant movement of the pilgrims. But there is something more. An electric tension that runs through the groups of men discussing in low voices under the porticos. They do not look at each other, but fix their gaze on nothing, with jaws clenched and hands hidden, as if trying to contain a fury born from the inability to control what is happening. Spiritual blindness, when confronted with direct light, often manifests as unbearable vertigo, a nausea of the soul that prefers to destroy the source of light rather than recognize the very deformity it reveals. The psychology of aggressive denial is the final defense mechanism of one who has built their entire life on a foundation of sacred deceptions, where the presence of Jesus functions as a mirror that accepts no flattery. For the Pharisees, the Master's words were not just teachings. They were personal attacks on their existential security, because he did not just point out their errors, he exposed the futility of their entire lifetime of effort. Whereas if you have ever felt an irrational anger when someone confronted a vice or behavior you swore no one saw, you know the poison that dripped from the lips of these men when they plotted the death of the one who called them blind guides. The pain of being exposed is so great that the spiritual blind man prefers to put out the sun to continue living in the illusion that his darkness is clarity, transforming his fear into religious zeal and his hatred into divine justice. Nor as Jesus walked calmly through the crowd, his simple presence provoked a collapse in the belief systems of those around him, forcing them to choose between the humiliation of repentance or the hardening of the heart. The guardians of the law were caught in a trap they themselves had dug. They were so afraid of losing control over the people that they lost control over themselves, becoming prisoners of a blind fury that prevented them from seeing the miracles happening just a few feet away. The paradox of the soul that dies in the light reaches its breaking point here, where religion becomes the greatest obstacle to finding God, and where the defense of truth becomes the motive for murdering truth incarnate. It is a state of spiritual dementia, where the individual is convinced they are performing a service to God while fighting against Him, proving that the worst darkness is that which has convinced itself that it is the exclusive bearer of light. The skin of these leaders now seems stiffer, almost like a shell protecting them from the touch of grace, reflecting a process of internal petrification that began long ago with a small lie about their intentions. They are like generals who continue to fight a war that has already ended, refusing to accept the terms of a peace that would require the surrender of their weapons and their cardboard crowns. Spiritual blindness is a repeated choice, an accumulated no against the still, a small voice calling us out of our caves of pride and inviting us into the open field of radical honesty. The cost of this resistance is a life of secret bitterness, where the pleasure of being right is the only reward left for a soul that no longer knows what it is to be loved, and that has already forgotten what it's like to close one's eyes and simply trust in the light that does not come from oneself. The midday sun begins to decline, but the heat retained in the stones of the temple creates a stifling atmosphere, where the air seems stagnant and charged with an invisible electricity. You observe the movement of the Levites preparing the afternoon sacrifices. The sound of knives being sharpened and the bleating of sheep form a symphony of death that no one seems to notice anymore. So mechanical has it become. There is a visible weariness in the eyes of the masters watching the crowd, a fatigue born of the constant need to police the thoughts of others while their own are in shambles. Spiritual blindness, at this point, manifests as a paralysis of empathy, where the pain of the neighbor is seen only as a theological variable or an infraction of purity norms. They look at the man born blind or the paralytic by the wayside and do not see a brother in suffering, but a clinical case of inherited sin or an opportunity to test someone else's orthodoxy. The psychology of dehumanization is the advanced stage of religious pride, where the individual feels so far above the rest of humanity that they lose the capacity to recognize the sacred value of an ordinary life. For the spiritual blind man, who has convinced himself that he is the possessor of light, everyone else is just an unimportant shadow, mere extras in the theater of his own holiness. If you have ever felt invisible within a faith community, or if you noticed that rules were more important than your weeping, you have experienced the cold of this eclipse of the soul. The pain of living under this regime is that the heart becomes a smooth stone, impermeable to the touch of grace and unable to reflect any human warmth, transforming religion into a fortress of ice, where love is the first victim. As Jesus leaned down to write in the earth before the woman caught in adultery, he was dismantling centuries of a psychology of accusation that sustained the ego of the religious. They held the stones tightly, knuckles white with tension, not out of a desire for justice, but out of a thirst to reaffirm their own cleanliness through the extermination of someone else's dirt. Spiritual blindness is, at its core, an inability to look down and see that our own feet are also dirty with the same dust of the road. And when the Master uttered the phrase that disarmed hands and souls, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone," he was not just saving a life. He was offering a final opportunity for vision to those who were blinded by their own Puritanism. The skin of these men, marked by rigor and the lack of real smiles, seems to stretch over their bones with a rigidity that denies any fluidity of spirit. They are the guardians of a law that has become a corpse in their hands, a set of orders that no longer points to the Creator, but to the very maintenance of the system. The soul dies in the light when the individual confuses the possession of truth with the embodiment of truth, forgetting that light only fulfills its purpose when it allows us to see the path, and not when we use it to blind those walking beside us. The cost of this blindness is a void that no ritual can fill, a soul hunger that one tries to satisfy with power and influence. Thus, while the true source of life passes by, ignored by those who decided they have already seen all there was to be seen. The morning sun of Jerusalem begins its descent, casting long, distorted shadows that seem to stretch across the temple stones like dark fingers trying to reach what remains of the light. You walk through the outer courts, where the sound of theological discussions mixes with the noise of pigeons flapping their wings against the high cedar ceilings, creating a sense of enclosure even in such a vast space. There is an almost geometric rigor in how the groups are divided. Those who consider themselves pure on one side, those seen as people of the land on the other. An invisible but insurmountable boundary made of contempt and emotional distance. Spiritual blindness at this stage manifests as an absolute inability to recognize the image of God in anyone who does not speak the same religious dialect or follow the same ritual minutiae. They created a holiness measured by the distance they can maintain from the sinner, transforming isolation into a badge of honor, while their inner world becomes increasingly sterile and devoid of any real human warmth. The sunlight now hits the bronze basins of the temple, creating golden reflections that hurt the eyes of those who try to face the center of the courtyard, while the air becomes unbreathable due to the mixture of expensive incense and the persistent smell of blood rising from the drainage channels. You observe the priests moving with surgical precision, their linen aprons stained red, witnessing a routine of death that has become so commonplace that the meaning of sacrifice has been lost in the technique. There is a terrifying coldness in the way they handle the sacred, as if they were operating a complex machine instead of standing before the Creator of the universe. Spiritual blindness in this advanced stage manifests as an inability to feel the weight of human life. Where people cease to be souls in need of love to become just objects of religious regulation or obstacles to the maintenance of liturgical order. The psychology of desensitization is the direct result of decades of a performance-based religiosity, where the heart is systematically silenced so the mind can focus on the perfect execution of the law. for the spiritual blind man walking the corridors of power in Jerusalem. The healing of a man on the Sabbath is not a cause for celebration, but an unforgivable technical failure that threatens the stability of the system they swore to protect. If you have ever felt like you were treated as a number or a problem to be solved by those who should be your shepherds, you know the icy desert of this eclipse of mercy. The pain of living under this gaze is the feeling that God is an implacable accountant who cares more about the accuracy of your rituals than the integrity of your wounds, creating a distorted divine image that drives the sinner away instead of drawing them in. While Jesus stopped in the middle of the crowd to touch the hand of a leper, defying all current purity laws, he was performing a spiritual autopsy on the blindness of those men of clean robes and dry hearts. They recoiled in horror, not at the man's disease, but at the ritual contamination Jesus was embracing, proving that for them, religious etiquette was more valuable than the restoration of a human being. Blindness prevents them from seeing that the true glory of God is not in the shine of gold or the smoke of burnt offerings, but in the recovery of the dignity of one who has been crushed by life. The paradox is devastating. They offer thousands of lambs on the altar to atone for sins, but they cannot offer a single moment of real compassion to the Lamb of God standing before them, exposing their own emotional and spiritual bankruptcy. The skin of these men now seems to have the temperature of marble, devoid of the heat emanating from a life inhabited by the Holy Spirit, reflecting an interior that has turned into a museum of prohibitions instead of a garden of fruits. They are the guardians of an altar that consumes people to feed the institution and transforming faith into a weapon of exclusion and the temple into an exile for those who cannot achieve the required perfection. The soul dies in the light when the individual confuses the defense of doctrine with the love of God, killing the spirit to preserve the letter and ignoring that the ultimate goal of all revelation is reconciliation and healing. The cost of this blindness is a void that screams in the silence of the night, a conscience that knows that, despite all the sacrifices offered, the distance between them and real peace only increases, while the true light continues to shine for the humble, leaving the proud locked in their own magnificent darkness. The late afternoon sun strikes the court of the Gentiles at an angle, transforming the dust raised by hundreds of feet and animals into a dense golden curtain that almost hides the monumental columns. You walk through this space, and what you hear is not the murmur of prayer, but the strident chaos of a market in full swing. The shout of money changers announcing exchange rates, the desperate bleating of lambs trapped in cramped pens, and the metallic sound of coins hitting wooden tables. The smell of manure and sweat mixes with the scent of incense escaping from the sanctuary, creating an atmosphere where the profane and the sacred have merged such that no one can distinguish them anymore. Spiritual blindness, in this economic dimension, it manifests as the inability to realize that the temple has become a guilt management business, where salvation has a list price and faith has been reduced to a cold and efficient commercial transaction. They look at the poor pilgrim who comes from afar and see not a soul thirsty for God, but a customer who needs to be exploited through the sale of approved animals at extortionate prices. There's the psychology of the commodification of faith, is the stage where the religious ego discovers it can profit from the spiritual need of others, creating a system of dependence where the presence of God is monopolized by a financial elite. For the spiritual blind man managing the exchange booths, religion is a tool of power and accumulation, a structure that protects his interests while keeping the masses in a state of ritual submission. And if you have ever felt that your church has become a business, where budget growth is more important than the growth of the believer's maturity, you know the stench of this market of the sacred. The pain of living under this logic is the realization that you are just a pawn in a fundraising scheme, and that your value to the institution is directly linked to your ability to contribute, and not to the sincerity of your search for redemption. Thus, when Jesus entered this courtyard and overturned the tables of the money changers, he was not just reacting against physical commerce. He was dealing a death blow to the blindness of those who believe they can buy divine favor. The sweat dripping down his face and the force with which he held the whip of cords revealed a holy indignation against those who had turned the house of prayer into a den of thieves. The teachers of the law, however, they watched the scene with a hatred born of the loss of prophets, unable to see that this man was trying to save what remained of the nation's spiritual integrity. Blindness prevents them from seeing that the true sacrifice God desires is a broken and contrite heart, something no silver coin can pay for and no market booth can offer. The skin of these managers of the sacred now seems to have the texture of the leather of the money bags they carry, hardened by greed and the lack of scruples disguised as maintenance of worship. They are the guardians of a system that exchanges the glory of God for the convenience of gold, transforming the encounter with the eternal into a burdensome bureaucracy that drives away the humble and attracts the opportunists. The soul dies in the light when a person begins to use the things of God to serve themselves, losing the notion that they are just a steward and starting to act as if they were the owner of truth and grace. The cost of this choice is an internal bankruptcy that no institutional success can hide. A poverty of spirit manifested in the inability to feel joy for the freedom of others. For to the mercantile blind man, the freedom of the flock means the end of his control and his source of wealth. The evening light begins to bathe the upper terraces of the houses of the high priests, where the air is fresher and the sound of the temple chaos arrives only as a distant murmur. Like the sea hitting distant rocks, you observe the table set with fine delicacies, breads made of chosen wheat, and silver cups overflowing with a deep red wine that glows under the flare of the torches just lit. The men sitting around this luxury have soft skin, protected from the sun by scented oils, and in their hands, which never touch the wound of a needy person, move with an elegance that hides the rigidity of souls that no longer know what it is to hunger for God. There is a lethal satisfaction in this scene, a feeling that the kingdom of heaven has already been conquered through bloodlines and political alliances, transforming messianic hope into an administrative possession they manage with the coldness of those dealing with real estate. Spiritual blindness, here dressed in purple, he manifests as absolute self-sufficiency, where the need for a savior is seen as something for the ignorant masses, while for the elite, God is just the guarantor of a status quo that ensures them comfort and reverence. The psychology of spiritual privilege is the ground where the conviction grows that divine favor is an acquired right and not an unmerited grace, and creating an abyss of indifference between the holy and the miserable. To the spiritual blind man inhabiting the palaces of Jerusalem, the Messiah should not come to heal hearts, but to ratify the power of those who already dominate, transforming spirituality into a tool of social legitimation. If you have ever felt that your spiritual life has become an accessory to your lifestyle, or if you realize that your search for God is, in truth, a search for validation of your own successes, you know the bitter taste of this banquet of ashes. The pain of living in this bubble of privilege is the loss of the capacity to be surprised by truth. For everything is filtered by self-interest, leaving the soul so full of itself that no room remains for the breath of the Spirit, who prefers to dwell in places where need is confessed and bread is broken with trembling hands. While Jesus told the story of the rich man and Lazarus, he was projecting a raw light on the blindness of those who turned their spiritual heritage into a private banquet. ignoring the beggar who lay at the door with exposed sores. The teachers of the law, sitting in their seats of honor, heard those words with a cynical smile, unable to see that they were the rich man who would soon wake up in an eternity of thirst where their genealogies would have no value at all. And blindness prevents them from seeing that a people's true wealth is its capacity to care for its most fragile members, and that the glory of God withdraws from palaces when they become fortresses against the world's pain. The paradox is tragic. They have the best lights, the best clothes, and the best food. But their souls are withering in deep malnutrition, dying of thirst in the middle of water sources they themselves polluted with their pride and their lack of love. The skin of these aristocrats of faith now seems to have the transparency of glass, cold and brittle, revealing an interior where the passion for the sacred has been replaced by the calculation of influence, and where the altar has been exchanged for the negotiation table. They are the guardians of a tradition that has become a trap, a system that protects them from reality, but also exiles them from the true presence of God, who manifests more clearly in the dust of the road than in the glitter of their silver. The soul dies in the light when a person believes they already have everything God can offer, closing the door to the novelty of grace and the risk of a life dependent on providence. The cost of this artificial fullness is a golden loneliness, where one is surrounded by servants and sycophants, but where the silence of God is the only guest that never leaves, whispering in the ears of those who no longer want to hear that the banquet is over and that what remains are only ashes and the cold of an eternity without vision. The moonlight now rests over the domes of Jerusalem like a sheet of cold silver, while the wind rising from the Kidron Valley brings the scent of damp olive trees and ancient earth that seems to breathe under the weight of the sacred. You find yourself on a high terrace, one where the sound of the city sleeping is just a whisper of smoke and shadows, and where the stars seem to observe with divine indifference the unfolding of small human tragedies. There is an oppressive stillness in the scribes' quarters, where shelves groan under the weight of parchment scrolls containing centuries of theological debates, grammatical definitions, and legal minutiae that turn the living word into an object of laboratory dissection. Spiritual blindness, in this intellectual sphere, manifests as a veil of erudition that prevents direct contact with the mystery, where the individual becomes capable of explaining the origin of light, but remains unable to be illuminated by it. They master the structure of the divine sentence, but have lost the sense of the voice that uttered it, turning into librarians of a God they no longer expect to find in the corridors of their own life. The psychology of religious intellectualism is the most refined form of resistance to the Spirit, for it offers the illusion of closeness to God through mental gymnastics, while keeping the heart armored against any demand for repentance. To the spiritual blind man who prides himself on his vast mental library, the simplicity of Jesus' teachings is seen as a theological vulgarity, an attack on the complexity they took generations to build to justify their own conveniences. If you have ever felt that your faith has become an exercise in logic, or if you notice that you read the Bible only to find arguments for your opinions, you know the cold of this night of intelligence. The pain of living in this state is the dehydration of the soul, where much information is consumed but no transformation is produced, leaving the individual trapped in a labyrinth of concepts where he is the master, but where the Holy Spirit is a stranger who does not allow himself to be domesticated by academic definitions. While Jesus spoke of a kingdom that belongs to the humble and those with the heart of a child, he was striking a direct blow at the arrogance of those who believed heaven was the prize for the law's best students. The scribes heard those words with an intellectual disdain, that hid a deep fear that their authority based on knowledge could be replaced by authority based on being. The blindness prevents them from seeing that knowledge that does not translate into worship and love is just a sophisticated form of idolatry of one's own ego, a monument to intelligence that serves only to mask the spirit's bankruptcy. The paradox is cruel. They have the keys to knowledge, but they do not enter the kingdom and prevent those who want to enter, transforming truth into a weapon of exclusion instead of an invitation to eternal life. The skin of these men, yellowed by lamplight and marked by a lack of contact with the reality of common life, seems to have the texture of the paper they handle so much, without the bloom of one who is nourished by the Creator's real presence. They are prisoners of a system that values the footnote more than radical obedience, creating a culture where debate replaces encounter and theory eliminates experience. The soul dies in the light when a person believes that understanding a verse is the same as living it, like closing themselves in a theological monologue that makes them insensitive to the world's cry and God's silence. The cost of this choice is an erudite loneliness, where one is surrounded by the most brilliant minds of the past, but remains blind to the face of the Messiah who weeps at the door, asking to enter a heart that is too busy trying to define what the word love actually means. The air in Jerusalem has become heavy, almost solid, and as if the sky itself were holding its breath before an imminent collapse. You walk through the streets leading to Golgotha, and what you see is no longer the glow of the temple marble, but the gray dust of a city preparing for its greatest mistake. The smell of iron and the bitter sweat of the crowd mix with the scent of the raw wood of the cross tearing the air, creating an atmosphere of contained violence about to overflow. At the top of the hill, under a light that begins to fail supernaturally, the religious leaders observe the scene with arms crossed over their chests, their faces illuminated by a somber triumph that deep down is just the last spasm of a soul that has lost itself completely. Spiritual blindness reaches its point of irreversibility here. They look at the Creator of life hanging between heaven and earth and see no redemption. They see only the end of a political problem and the restoration of their shaken authority. The psychology of the final execution is the stage where blindness transforms into pure hatred, a need to annihilate the light so that darkness can finally reign without the inconvenience of truth. To the spiritual blind man who orchestrated the crucifixion, Jesus is not a victim. He is a heresy that needed to be erased so that the sacred system could continue its route of self-glorification. And if you have ever felt the temptation to suffocate your own conscience to maintain a sin or a lifestyle you know God condemns, you know the deadly silence that settled in the hearts of these men as the sky darkened at noon. The pain of this stage is the absence of pain. It is the total numbing of the soul that can no longer distinguish between good and evil, between murder and sacrifice, becoming capable of the greatest atrocities in the name of a religion that no longer has God. When the curtain of the temple was torn from top to bottom, revealing the Holy of Holies to everyone's eyes, the blindness of the teachers of the law manifested in their desire to sew the curtain back together, instead of entering through the door that Jesus' blood had just opened. They preferred the manufactured mystery to the revealed presence, the control of divine access to the freedom of the Spirit now blowing over all flesh. The paradox is absolute and terrible. At the moment, the brightest light in human history manifested in Christ's total surrender. Those who should have been the first to see were the ones who closed their eyes the tightest, plunging into a darkness that not even the sun of the resurrection could immediately penetrate. The soul dies in the light when a person sees the miracle and decides it is a work of the devil, closing the last window of hope for their own salvation. The skin of these men, under the artificial darkness of that afternoon, now seems to merge with the shadows, losing any trace of humanity and becoming part of the desolation scenery they themselves created. They are the guardians of an empty tomb they insist on saying is full, living in a parallel reality where their victory is, in truth, their definitive defeat. The soul dies in the light when it refuses to die to itself, trying to preserve a life of appearances while real life offers itself in sacrifice to save us. The cost of this final blindness is eternal exile from God's presence, an existence spent polishing the stones of a temple that no longer houses glory. While the true temple rose on the third day, leaving the blind to grope at the walls of a religion that became merely a monument to their own brilliant ruin. The silence following the earthquake in Jerusalem is more deafening than the crash of the stones cracking. You walk now through a city that seems to have aged 1,000 years in just 3 days, where the air is saturated with the smell of cold incense and the humidity of caves opened by the earth's force. The light of Sunday morning is not like the light of any other day. It has an ethereal quality, a glow that seems born from the ground itself, and that passes through the cracks of the closed doors where the disciples hide, and where the religious leaders desperately try to maintain order. You observe the temple guards, men trained for immobility, their eyes bloodshot with terror, reporting something the logic of their masters cannot process. Spiritual blindness, in its final gasp, it now manifests as a conspiracy of silence. They prefer to pay for bribes and lies than to open their eyelids to the fact that the tomb is empty and death has been swallowed up by victory. The psychology of post-resurrection denial is the final stage of the soul that has become a bunker. To the spiritual blind man who saw the torn curtain and the removed stone, the truth has become an existential enemy that needs to be buried at all costs, even if he has to murder his own sanity to do so. And if you have ever received a miracle, an answer, or clear evidence of God's goodness, but chose to attribute it to luck or chance so you wouldn't have to change your life, you know the trembling in the hands of those trying to explain the unexplainable. The pain of this state is the agony of knowing that light won, but feeling condemned to live in the shadows as a matter of pride. I'm transforming one's own existence into a continuous effort to put out a flame that has already set the universe on fire. While Jesus walked with the disciples of Emmaus, explaining the scriptures until their hearts burned, he was performing the inverse miracle of blindness, the opening of eyes through vulnerability and communion. The teachers of the law, on the other hand, locked themselves in dark rooms to discuss how to silence witnesses, proving that knowledge without love is a life sentence. The soul dies in the light when it confuses the protection of the institution with the protection of the truth, and when it prefers a religion of well-organized corpses to a faith of unpredictable living beings. The paradox closes here. The light that blinds the proud is the same that heals the humble, and the difference is not in the intensity of the glow, but in the heart's willingness to let itself be seen entirely, without masks or defenses. The skin of those who refuse to see the resurrection now seems grayish, as if life fled from them the moment they decided the stone was still in place. They become ghosts of a system that no longer exists, preaching to pews empty of meaning and offering sacrifices to a God who has already risen and gone out into the streets. The soul dies in the light when a person becomes immune to wonder, when the supernatural is reduced to a public relations problem, and when salvation is seen as a threat to their lifestyle. The final cost of this blindness is the eternal void of one who had eternity by their side, felt the heat of his breath, and heard the sound of his voice, but preferred the cold comfort of a tomb sealed by their own will. We have come to the end of this journey through the shadows of Jerusalem and the labyrinths of our own souls. What we saw was not just the fall of an ancient religious system, but the mirror of our own resistance to the light. Spiritual blindness is not a lack of information. It is an excess of self. If this script touched the wounds you tried to hide under your own whitewash of perfection, remember, light only burns what is false. What is true, it illuminates and heals. And the question that remains echoing in the empty courtyards of your heart is the same that echoed in the corridors of the temple. Will you continue to polish the stones of your own pride? Or will you allow the light of the world to open your eyes to a life that doesn't need masks? The decision to see is the first step toward resurrection. If this journey broke the silence of your soul, and you felt that for a long time you used your religiosity to hide from God instead of finding Him, this is your moment of crossing. Don't let the light you carry be just a spotlight for your ego. If you wish to trade the weight of appearances for the rest of truth, subscribe here and turn on notifications. We are not just a channel. We are a community of eyes that decided to open. Comment below. Today, I choose to see. Let that phrase be your landmark of liberation. The time for pretending is over. Real vision has begun.